It's day 215. It's also December 7th, 2019. And we are in Bisbee, Arizona. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. Bisbee. A fascinating place, I can tell already. A lot to get to and a lot to learn. But first, a little bit more about some stuff I'd learned along the way. That way between a place on 2 Cal Road over there in the Sonoran Desert, that place we learned of Gila monsters and the other natural-born killers of the Arizona desert, and this place we find ourselves today, with a mining history as rich as any. A history that broke records, broke norms. And Bisbee has lived through that history and created a personality and a presence of its very own. No place on earth can make claims to history that Bisbee can, and does. But back to our last night on 2 Cal Road, digging around on the internet a little bit more. I'd learned of all those incredible engineering feats that had enabled an ancient civilization to prosper in the Arizona desert, long before anyone called it the Arizona desert. And now modern technology would take water management to another level and build that piece of the Sonoran Desert into one of the largest metropolitan, economic, and cultural centers in the country. But in the middle of all this, I'd also learn of a place called Pierce, Arizona. Pierce is a small rural community south of Phoenix, opposite of where we were on 2 Cal Road, and just 50 miles or so from where we are here in Bisbee. In many respects, Pierce is not unlike any other community, large or small, in Arizona. The town was born in 1894 when a guy named James Pierce discovered gold and filed a claim for the Commonwealth mine, a mine that would go on to deliver over $8 million in silver and $2.5 million worth of gold. And after the mining years, the town's future would follow that of many mining towns, for a time even being considered a ghost town, a legacy it holds on to and celebrates to this day. And today, it's a community of just over 2,000 folks that enjoy a quiet life, a few of them continuing generational traditions of ranching and farming in the area. So why does a place like Pierce pop up when a guy's reading about water management in the desert? Well, for me, it popped up in the form of a video titled, "In This Town, Only the Rich Get Water." I watched that 8-minute video, produced by the YouTube channel More Perfect Union, and would learn that everything I'd learned to date about water management in the deserts of Arizona revolved around surface water assets. I hadn't given much thought to the importance of groundwater in the region, or that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, rely on groundwater for their survival in the desert. And there are no dams or canals that can help when it comes to groundwater levels in the Wilcox Valley area of Arizona. And I certainly had not considered what it might be like to get up one morning, turn on the faucet to make that first pot of coffee of the day, only to learn that there was no more water. And learning, in the next few hours, that you're not experiencing a broken pump or an electrical issue. Your well is dry. But then, to go on to learn that the reason your well is dried up is not because you exhausted the resource, it's because someone else had. And that someone else is a $500 million a year large-scale dairy operation by the name of Riverview. The story of Riverview is literally the American story. A company born in 1939 in Minnesota as a small family-owned operation, but would evolve over the years into the multifaceted partnership, primarily employee-owned company that it is today. And in 2014, the company would expand its operation into the Arizona desert, purchasing thousands of acres of farmland. Now, for all its outward appearance, Riverview appears to work hard and ethically, respecting its employees, the land on which they operate, and working to contribute to the communities in which they live. But appearances aren't always what they seem. When your operation requires millions of gallons of water each and every day, for example, who knew that the average dairy cow consumes nearly 25 gallons of water each day? And those alfalfa fields they irrigate every day to feed those 70,000 or so cows, well, they drink a lot of water too. And these demands, when placed on the area's groundwater tables for nearly a decade now, well, that leads to the scenario in which a neighboring farmer or rancher or retired veteran turns on their faucet in the morning and gets nothing. Now, pretty drastic measures have to be taken pretty immediately the day you learn you don't have access to water in your home or on your ranch. And hence the title of the video. In this town, only the rich get water. See, as the water tables in the Arizona desert continue to drop, drilling a well is no cheap proposition. And as the effects of large-scale operations like Riverview continue to drive the water tables down, residents are now faced with a $20,000 to $50,000 bill just to keep water in their well. And believe it or not, the cost can go even higher. You're charged by the foot. So the deeper you have to go, at up to $65 a foot, yikes. The average depth of a well across the region is nearing 800 feet to reach a reliable source, and in some areas, deeper. But just 10 years ago, a well could easily sustain a property at 200 to 400 feet. Now, it isn't hard to believe that many in the area can't afford to write that check. And option B, buy water storage tanks at a few $1,000s a pop and begin having water trucked in, well, that doesn't sound cheap either. Certainly not convenient. So it appears that some are resorting to living a life out of 5-gallon jugs of water as they try to sort things out. And some may even face the proposition of selling their homes, which essentially means abandoning them, because that's exactly what happens when you try to sell a property with no running water. It doesn't exactly fetch top dollar. And like always, if you keep clicking, keep reading, keep watching videos, you'll learn more. There's more to every story. And as I read of this, I wondered, how could there be no rules, no laws? It's 2019. How can it be that a large-scale operation can move into an area and literally start stealing water from those around it, simply because they can write checks big enough to dig as deep and as often as they want? Well, they can, because according to local residents, and I checked it, Arizona messed up and is yet to fix it. In the early 1980s, Arizona passed legislation that would regulate water consumption and protect folks from exactly what's happening in Pierce. The problem? The regulations applied only to larger metropolitan areas. In larger cities across the state, large corporations are held to strict usage standards and bear the cost across the region for maintaining a reliable source of water for the entire community. But they left about 80% of the state out of being held accountable to these regulations. In the large expanses of the state outside those metro areas, in places like Pierce, Arizona is still considered the Wild West, literally, when it comes to water rights and usage. If you can write the check, you can have it, and you can take as much as you want, regardless of the impact on those around you, your neighbors. And reading a little further and listening a little longer, I'd learned that Riverview, well, they're not the only ones to have figured this out. All across Arizona, big business has been on a bit of a buying spree of sorts, buying up existing ranches and farms, expanding and profiting, while the local, generational ranchers and farmers that either sell off or fail are being replaced with new owners in the area. Owners like a Saudi prince, New York investment firms, and even billion-dollar insurance companies are becoming the new face of Arizona's farmer. Kinda hurts to read of folks that invested their life in land that would fulfill their dreams of living a quiet life in the desert Southwest, and building something to leave to their family. Or the small rancher, third generation, struggling to keep a 2,200-acre ranch afloat, but slowly watching it slip away as the 55,000-acre operation up the way sucks 2 million gallons of water each and every day out of the Arizona desert. I would go on to read that Arizona as a whole faces significant water management challenges, including groundwater depletion, which can indirectly affect overall water availability and management strategies throughout the state. I wondered how many of the nearly 7.3 million folks that call Arizona home even know that their state is facing water management issues, and that even today they have neighbors, fellow Arizonans, that are waking up each and every morning forced to figure out how they're going to get water. A bit more reading, and it seems that Arizona is working on it. Let's just hope they work fast enough. And I'd also hope that companies like Riverview are actually working with them. And then there's this place called Bisbee. We found a great spot in a little RV park called the Queen Mine RV Park at the top of a hill. Even had a bit of a view. I thought immediately, I think we'll hang out here for a while. Bisbee is located in the southeast corner of the state. It was 1877 when a reconnaissance detail of Army scouts and cavalrymen, led by a civilian tracker, they were in the area searching for Apache renegades, but instead would discover signs of mineralization in the Mule Mountains. And what they were seeing were indications of lead, copper, and possibly even silver and gold deposits in the area. And it wouldn't be long until the first mining claim would be staked in the area. The original encampment was being referred to as Mule Gulch, but within just 3 years, in 1880, the town would be founded and named for a San Francisco attorney and judge by the name of DeWitt Bisbee, a financial backer of the Copper Queen mine. And it's sort of ironic that Mr. Bisbee would never even visit the town, even after all those checks he cashed. Things kept moving fast for Bisbee. The town quickly became known as Queen of the Copper Camps. And like many mining towns of the era, the community would grow fast. But Bisbee would grow faster and bigger than all those others. But just prior to the turn of the century, and before all that growth and prosperity, Bisbee would actually experience a rough patch and gain an even rougher reputation. A reputation as a dirty camp, a gross camp even, a smoke-filled and crime-ridden camp. The internet's littered with photos of the trash-laden streets of Bisbee. Over 50 saloons meant gambling and prostitution had run rampant. Gunfights were common, as were the dead carcasses of animals that were just left to rot in the streets of Bisbee alongside open sewer pits, adding to the stench of the town. Frequent flooding would only add to the challenges faced by the rough-and-tumble town. But then, as the town became the second-largest copper mining operation in the country, it would become incorporated on January 9th, 1902, and by 1910, it was the largest city in the Arizona Territory, with over 25,000 residents. In fact, During this same period of time, it was actually the largest city between St. Louis and San Francisco. And with this growth and prosperity, the town had begun cleaning up its act. Sewer systems installed, fresh water piped in, gambling and prostitution would be outlawed, city charters in place, law enforcement established, and the town continued to grow. The town's mines would go on to produce over 8 billion pounds of copper, 102 million ounces of silver, and almost 3 million ounces of gold, along with significant amounts of zinc, lead, and manganese. It would seem the town of Bisbee was off and running. However, Bisbee still had a rough patch or two in its future. Most notably, a labor strike in 1917, along with a chain of events that would go on to become known and go down in history as the Bisbee deportation. In 1917, open-pit mining had been introduced in Bisbee, and World War I had driven the price of copper even higher. Copper was now big business, and as I just learned, Bisbee had become the second largest producer of copper in the country. Not surprising that some labor issues would come along with such dramatic growth. See, the success of the mines had led to miners being required to work harder and longer to meet the need, but oftentimes at the same rate of pay, which drove tensions between the miners and the mine owners. Further exacerbating the problem, the influx of new miners into the area and the continued rapid growth of the town continued to drive the cost of living up, driving those frustrations even higher amongst thousands of hardworking miners. Now at the time, just some 20% of the town's miners were union members, and in May of 1917, those union members would present a list of demands to the mine owners. But when the demands were rejected, over 3,000 miners would begin to strike in June of that same year. The strikes were peaceful, but relatively ineffective. Even so, the mine owners became concerned that even though union membership amongst the strikers was low, they could still have an impact on the thinking of the miner population in general. And at this point, some crazy stuff started to happen. The mine owners would implement an unprecedented plan and begin actually deporting striking miners. A trial run of their plan would round up some 70 striking union members and deport them on July 10th of 1917. And then, 2 days later, on July 12th, the really crazy stuff would happen. When a posse of over 2,000 men, led by the sheriff of Bisbee, would hit the streets in the early morning hours and begin rounding up striking miners. They had carefully compiled a list of union members and local business owners, those they felt the most influential within the mining community, and thus posing the most significant threat to their operations. By the end of it, some 2,000 men would be rounded up and arrested. The sheriff would then offer each the opportunity to denounce the union and return to work. Wow, talk about my way or the highway. Around 700 of those arrested would accept the offer and quietly return to their families and their jobs. But the remaining 1,300 would be forced at gunpoint into cattle cars at the rail station and shipped 178 miles east to Columbus, New Mexico. Now the officials in Columbus, New Mexico objected, go figure, to the prospect of over 1,000 unemployed miners being dumped in their town. So the train would be forced to backtrack some 30 miles where the miners were indeed dumped in the desert of Hermanas, New Mexico, with no food, no water, and all of this after 16 hours in a cattle car on the hot Arizona desert. And now, with over 1,300 penniless miners stranded in the desert around Hermanas, now New Mexico had a problem. So the governor of New Mexico would reach out to President Wilson and ask for help. The president would send federal troops to the New Mexico desert to escort the abandoned miners back to Columbus, where they would be housed in tent communities for over 2 months, while the feds would launch an intensive investigation into the activity that had led to their deportation. Now, clearly, the mining operators, along with the local officials in Bisbee, had acted illegally and without merit, and in the end, several individuals would be arrested, but no one was ever convicted of a crime in relation to the Bisbee deportation, and those miners would never be allowed to return to Bisbee. Many would transition from those makeshift camps around Columbus, New Mexico, into neighboring towns. Some would find work in other mines in the area, and many would just leave the state altogether in search of a life elsewhere. And while no one individual was ever convicted of a crime during those events in 1917 Arizona, it would not only be a pivotal event in Arizona's history, it would also have its impact on labor laws across the entire country in the years to come. Now, when I hear the term the Wild West, all sorts of images are conjured up. The Indian Wars, cowboys forging a living on the wide open range, and rough and tumble saloon towns complete with gunfights and fistfights over a poker game gone wrong. Pioneers sweating in the hot sun behind mules and horses working their newly acquired homestead. Wagon trains pushing west and chasing gold. But never, ever, had I conjured up the image of thousands of hard-working miners being forced into cattle cars at gunpoint to be shipped off to and left for dead in the desert Southwest. Until now. And back in Bisbee, that Copper Queen mine would go on to become legend in the mining industry. Between 1917 and 1934, the mine would produce over 20 million tons of copper ore and grow to cover over 35 acres. And with over 2,000 miles of underground tunnel, the mine ranks to this day as one of the 5 largest underground mines in the world. It's pretty clear that the Copper Queen mine is nearly solely responsible for the town of Bisbee, Arizona, and it continues to hold its place in history as one of the richest mineral reserves ever discovered in the world. And in a time when a loaf of bread would set you back 2 cents, a night in the saloon could be covered by $1, it's no wonder that Americans came from across the country before, during, and after the Great Depression in hopes of landing a job in a mine that could offer them 35 cents an hour, or nearly $5 a day in wages. Also, interesting to learn that donkeys were introduced to the process around the turn of the century, and there were actually stables and a vet on staff in the mines. Some of these donkeys would not see daylight for 3 to 4 years and had to undergo a reintroduction to surface life and sunlight at the end of their service in the mines. They were oftentimes donated to local farmers, but many ended up running wild in the Arizona desert, which helps to explain the large wild donkey population across the state to this day, many of which we've actually seen and heard. Mining in Bisbee would continue until 1974 rolled around, when ore reserves were depleted, leading to the closure of mining operations. The rapid departure of residents would cause a real estate collapse as the town's population dropped dramatically to around 8,000 in just the first year or so, and then even lower. In the following years, different segments of the population would become drawn to the area. The extremely cheap real estate combined with the desirable climate in the area would draw retirees, as well as many from what was termed, at the time, the hippie culture, to the area. Bisbee has continued to evolve over these past 4 decades or so. Today, the population of just over 4,000 is known for its arts community, the preservation of that almost unbelievable past, and welcoming over 250,000 tourists each year. I guess this year, I'm just one of those tourists. A tourist that actually donned a hard hat and a safety vest hopped into one of those miner cars, drove deep into Arizona's mining past, and looked firsthand at the technology and the hard work that dug all that copper out of these mountains. The Copper Queen Mine and its storied past is a pretty super cool tour if you ever have the chance. We'd also have a bit of an adventure of a different sort during our stay in Bisbee. See, as we topped that hill on Dart Road and got situated in our spot in the Queen Mine RV park, I noticed a bit of mushiness in the brake pedal. And it was well after dark, so the next morning I checked things out to learn that, indeed, our brakes were going out. And while I was excited to begin exploring this place called Bisbee, I'd realized I'd have to wait just a bit. A quick check-in with the manager's office would point us to the Highway 98 Service Center, a well-respected local repair shop. And a quick shout-out to Oni Crowley and the whole gang down there at the service center. These are some pretty awesome guys. Hearing of our situation, they said, no problem, let's get you down here and figure things out. Now getting down there, remember, we're parked on top of a hill with a pretty tricky driveway up into the park. No problem when you have brakes, which we did not. But Oni was on that too. A phone call to a local towing company in old Vacilando was being carted up onto a flatbed tow truck within a couple of hours. Once down the hill and on the parking lot of the Highway 98 Service Center, Oni and Ricardo had us up and running in no time. What I had imagined potentially being a big deal, everything from master cylinder and brake lines and all sorts of ugliness had crossed my mind, turned out to be a simple failure at the passenger side front tire, which had allowed the system to depressurize, and a couple of hours later, we were headed back up the hill to settle in again and start our exploring. But this part of Arizona, well, it's more than just Bisbee. The truth is, there's a wide swath of Arizona between Tucson and the Mexican border that has something for nearly everyone. From hat-tipping cowboys clanking along the streets of Tombstone in their spur-clad boots, straightening their neckerchiefs and checking their pistols, all in preparation for the next gunfight at the OK Corral. A 30-minute reenactment of the famous gunfight that takes place 3 times each and every day. To checking out the classic car collection in Lowell, or that afternoon drive out to the Patagonia-Sonoyta Creek Reserve for a hike along the creek on your way out to Sierra Vista, home of the U.S. Army base, Fort Huachuca. Majestic cottonwoods along the creek banks and scattered about the countryside are monolithic in comparison to everything in their shadow. Even a drive down to the bustling border between the same named cities on either side, Nogales, Arizona, and Mexico. Nogales, Arizona, population around 20,000, but Nogales, Mexico, well over 200,000, making this a pretty busy stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. And driving through the quiet streets of Patagonia just today, it's hard to picture it as a bustling trading and supply hub for the surrounding mines. These days, its 900 or so residents are content to serve as an art and retirement community. And the surprise find were the cotton fields in Casa Grande. Who knew cotton being grown in Arizona? And walking the streets of Old Town Bisbee each evening would take a while to get old. A place that holds on to its old world charm with both hands, but somehow managing to celebrate the Wild West and boomtown it once was, while welcoming newcomers and the future. Driving through a December hailstorm, watching it roll through the multicolored mountain ranges, turning them white, and then melting away as if it had never happened, all within minutes. Knowing there's likely so much more to explore makes one certain to return, assuming you ever leave. Which leads me to that last afternoon in Bisbee, that last walk that led me into a vintage clothing shop where I met Nettie, a colorful and super friendly Australian lady who had relocated to Bisbee nearly 20 years ago. As I admired a pair of Lucchese boots, in my size even, she explained, in that awesome Australian accent, how she had recently dressed a young man in vintage clothing from head to toe for a Halloween event, and how fun it was. She went on to explain that folks were stopping him in the streets to take a photo with him in his vintage 20s attire. She then asked how long I had planned on staying in Bisbee. I explained that I had arrived intending to stay only a couple nights, but that was 9 days ago, so who knows? Nettie responded with a knowing grin and called out as I left the shop, "Hey, Bisbee, it just sort of happens, doesn't it?" I waved, and yup, Bisbee happened. And yup, I bought those boots. And yup, Bisbee will be back. Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.